Eddie Van Halen was sitting in the back of his nephew's guitar lesson, quietly watching, when the teacher asked if anyone wanted to demonstrate a technique. Eddie raised his hand. The teacher watched him play for 30 seconds, then stopped him with a concerned expression. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but that technique is fundamentally flawed. It might feel innovative, but it will never work for serious playing. Let me show you the correct way." Eddie smiled and said nothing. Then his nephew spoke up. "Mr. Peterson, that's my Uncle Eddie. Eddie Van Halen." The teacher's face went white. It was a Thursday afternoon in March 1995, and Eddie Van Halen was doing uncle duty. His sister had asked if he could pick up his nephew Wolfgang, who everyone called Wolfie, from guitar class at Pasadena Music Academy. Eddie arrived 20 minutes early, and rather than wait in the parking lot, he slipped into the back of the classroom wearing jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a baseball cap. Mr. Robert Peterson was teaching a group lesson to 5 students, including 14-year-old Wolfie. Peterson was patient, methodical, clearly knowledgeable, a classically trained guitarist who'd taught at the academy for 15 years. He was working through a blues scale exercise, having each student play while he corrected finger positioning and hand technique. "Remember," Mr. Peterson was saying, "consistency in technique is what separates professional musicians from amateurs. Every time you pick up the guitar, your hand position should be identical. Muscle memory is built through repetition of correct form." When Wolfie's turn came, Eddie felt proud. His nephew was good, with natural rhythm and good tone. After the students finished the exercise, Mr. Peterson wrote on the whiteboard, "Master the rules before you break them." "This is the most important principle in music education," Peterson continued. "Many beginners want to develop their own unique style before mastering fundamentals. But you cannot innovate successfully without first understanding why the rules exist. The successful ones, the true masters, learned proper technique first, then made informed decisions about which rules to break. The unsuccessful ones just played incorrectly and called it innovation." Eddie shifted in his seat. He understood the point intellectually. Foundation was important. But his own experience had been the opposite. He had developed his technique by ignoring traditional rules, experimenting, doing what felt right even when teachers told him it was wrong. Mr. Peterson noticed movement in the back. "I didn't realize we had a visitor. Are you picking up one of the students?" "Just watching," Eddie said quietly. "I'm getting Wolfie after class." "Wolfgang's father?" "Uncle." "Well, you're welcome to observe. Do you play guitar?" Wolfie's eyes went wide. He knew what was about to happen. "A little," Eddie said modestly. "Would you like to participate in our demonstration? I'm showing different approaches to playing the same scale. It would be helpful to see various skill levels." Eddie glanced at Wolfie, who was gesturing "no, no, no" under his desk. "Sure," Eddie said, standing up. "What would you like me to play?" Mr. Peterson handed Eddie his classical guitar. "Just play the blues scale we've been practicing. Start on the E string, 5th position." Eddie took the guitar. His stance was immediately different from what Peterson had been teaching, more casual, less rigid. His left hand positioned on the neck with his thumb wrapped over the top, not behind it, as classical technique demanded. Mr. Peterson noticed but didn't comment yet. Eddie played the blues scale, but he didn't play it straight and methodical like Peterson had been teaching. Eddie played it with feeling, adding slight bends, incorporating subtle vibrato, making the scale sound less like an exercise and more like a musical phrase. After about 30 seconds, Mr. Peterson held up his hand. "Okay, you can stop there. Thank you." Eddie stopped and looked up. Mr. Peterson turned to his students. "This is actually a perfect teaching example. Class, what did you notice about our visitor's technique?" One student raised her hand. "It sounded really cool?" "It did sound cool," Peterson agreed. "But let's talk about the technical issues. First, the hand position was incorrect, thumb over the neck instead of behind it. Second, the playing was inconsistent. Some notes held longer than others. Third, there were pitch bends that weren't part of the scale." Peterson turned back to Eddie, his expression kind but firm. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, and you obviously have some natural talent. But what you just demonstrated is exactly what I was explaining to my students. This technique feels innovative, but it's fundamentally flawed. Eddie nodded slowly. Flawed how? The thumb position creates tension in your hand that will limit your speed and precision at higher levels, Peterson explained. The inconsistent note duration means you lack rhythmic discipline, and adding embellishments like bends and vibrato before mastering the basic scale is putting style before substance. It might feel creative, but it will never work for serious playing. The other students were nodding, taking notes. Eddie looked at the guitar, then at Peterson. What would you recommend? Lessons, Peterson said gently. Proper training. You have potential, but you need to unlearn these bad habits before they become permanent. It's harder to fix incorrect technique than to learn correctly from the start. Peterson turned back to the class. This is why we emphasize proper form from day one. Many amateur guitarists play the way our visitor just demonstrated. It feels intuitive, it might even sound okay to untrained ears, but it will never allow you to reach professional level. The great guitarists, people like Joe Pass, Andres Segovia, even rock players like Eddie Van Halen, they all started with proper classical training. Wolfgang couldn't take it anymore. He'd been squirming in his seat, torn between letting this play out and saving his teacher from embarrassment. Mr. Peterson, Wolfie said, his voice cracking nervously, that is Eddie Van Halen. The classroom went dead silent. Mr. Peterson's face froze. I'm sorry, what? My uncle. That's Eddie Van Halen. I thought you knew. Mr. Peterson looked at Wolfgang, then at Eddie, then back. No, you're joking. Eddie took off his baseball cap. With his long curly hair visible, he was suddenly very recognizable. Oh my God, Mr. Peterson whispered. The other students realized what was happening. One blurted out, You just told Eddie Van Halen his technique is flawed. Eddie held up his hands, calming the situation. It's okay. Mr. Peterson was making valid points about classical technique. But Peterson had gone pale. I told you your playing would never work for serious playing. I said you needed lessons to fix your bad habits. I used you as an example of what not to do. You did, Eddie agreed calmly. And from a classical guitar perspective, you weren't wrong. My technique is unorthodox. Unorthodox? Peterson looked faint. You invented modern tapping technique. You changed how rock guitar is played. You're one of the most influential guitarists in history, and I just told you your playing is fundamentally flawed. The classroom erupted, students laughing nervously, excited by the drama. Wolfgang had his head in his hands, mortified. Eddie let them settle down. Mr. Peterson, can we talk for a minute? Just you and me? They stepped into the hallway while students buzzed with excitement inside. Peterson looked devastated. I am so sorry, Peterson said. That was humiliating. I feel like an idiot. Don't, Eddie said firmly. You were teaching proper technique. That's your job, and you weren't wrong about classical technique being important. But I told Eddie Van Halen his technique is fundamentally flawed. It is, Eddie said with a smile. According to classical guitar training, my thumb position is wrong. My vibrato is inconsistent. I break about a dozen rules of proper technique. You were absolutely right about that. Then how did you become Eddie Van Halen? Because sometimes the wrong technique is the right one for the music you're trying to create, Eddie said. Look, what you're teaching, classical form, consistent technique, mastering fundamentals, that's valuable. Those are real skills. But here's what I think you're missing. Technique is a tool, not a goal. The goal is making music that connects with people. The technique is just how you get there. But you agreed your technique is flawed? From a classical perspective, absolutely, Eddie said. If I wanted to play classical guitar professionally, I'd be terrible. My technique doesn't work for that. But for rock guitar? For the specific sound I wanted to create? My wrong technique was exactly right. Peterson leaned against the wall. I've been teaching for 15 years. I emphasize proper form, correct technique, following established methods. And I just told one of the greatest guitarists alive that his playing is wrong. You told me my playing was wrong for what you teach, Eddie said, and you were right. If Wolfie wants to play classical guitar, your technique is perfect. If he wants to read complex sheet music and play in an orchestra, he needs exactly what you're teaching him. But if he wants to create new sounds, to innovate, to develop his own voice, he might need to break some of your rules. So everything I'm teaching is wrong. No, Eddie said emphatically. Everything you're teaching is a foundation, but foundation isn't the same as a ceiling. You're giving students tools. What they do with those tools, whether they follow all your rules or break some, that's up to them. The problem isn't that you teach proper technique. The problem is suggesting there's only one right way to play. Peterson was quiet. I tell my students to master the rules before breaking them. That's fair, Eddie said, but I want you to understand something. I never mastered classical rules. I barely learned them. I broke rules I didn't even know existed. And it worked for me because I was focused on creating a specific sound, not on being technically correct. So what should I tell my students now? Eddie thought for a moment. Tell them the truth. Tell them that classical technique is one path to making music, but not the only path. Tell them to learn the fundamentals, but also to trust their instincts. Tell them that some of the greatest innovations in music came from people who didn't know they were breaking rules, so they broke them without fear. They returned to the classroom. Peterson stood at the front and took a breath. Class, I owe you an apology, and I owe Mr. Van Halen an apology. I just demonstrated exactly the kind of rigid thinking I should be teaching you to avoid. He turned to Eddie. Would you play something that shows why your technique works? Eddie picked up the classical guitar. This is going to sound weird on nylon strings, but here goes. He played the opening tapping section from Eruption, adapted for classical guitar, demonstrating the two-handed tapping technique that had revolutionized rock guitar. On a classical guitar, it sounded strange and beautiful, not the aggressive rock sound, but the pure musicality of the technique itself. When Eddie finished, the classroom was silent with awe. That technique, Peterson said quietly, is not in any classical guitar textbook. I couldn't teach that because I don't know how to do it. Nobody knew how before Eddie invented it, Wolfgang said proudly. Eddie set down the guitar. The point isn't that my way is better than classical technique. The point is that different music requires different approaches. What Mr. Peterson is teaching you is valuable. Learn it, master it if you can, but don't let it be the only thing you know. Music is bigger than any one technique. Peterson nodded slowly. I think I've been teaching technique as if it's music itself, rather than as a tool to make music. That's an easy trap, Eddie said, especially when you're good at technique. You start thinking that's what matters most. One student asked, Mr. Van Halen, did you ever take formal lessons? A few, Eddie admitted. My father tried to teach me classical piano. I was terrible because I didn't want to play what was on the sheet music. I wanted to play what I heard in my head. Eventually, he accepted I was going to do things my own way. Do you wish you'd had more formal training? Eddie thought about that. Sometimes, there are technical players who can do things I can't because they have better classical training. But would more training have helped me create the music I created? Maybe it would have made me more technically proficient, but less innovative. It's impossible to say. Eddie spent 20 minutes with the class discussing learning, innovation, the balance between respecting tradition and creating something new. Peterson listened as intently as his students. When class ended, Peterson pulled Eddie aside. Thank you for not making me feel worse than I already did. You're a good teacher, Eddie said sincerely. Wolfie's learned a lot from you. He has good fundamental technique. When he's ready to develop his own style, that foundation you gave him will serve him well. I'm going to change how I teach, Peterson said. Not completely. Fundamentals still matter, but I'm going to stop presenting technique as if it's the goal rather than the path. Years later, Wolfgang Van Halen would become a successful musician, not just as Van Halen's bassist, but eventually as a solo artist and multi-instrumentalist. In interviews, he often credited his early teacher, Mr. Peterson, with giving him solid fundamentals, and his uncle Eddie with teaching him that fundamentals were just the beginning. Mr. Peterson became known at Pasadena Music Academy as the teacher who'd told Eddie Van Halen his technique would never work, then learned from the experience. He kept teaching classical guitar fundamentals because they matter, but he stopped teaching them as if they were the only way. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Have you ever been told you were doing something wrong only to find out they were wrong? Share your experience in the comments below.